On January 3rd, 2026, at approximately 2 a.m. local time, explosions rocked northern Venezuela. Within hours, President Donald Trump announced that U.S. forces had captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores in Operation Absolute Resolve. This wasn't fiction. This was real military action that has shocked the world. The operation involved Delta Force Special Operations troops and CIA intelligence support, marking the most dramatic escalation in U.S.-Venezuela relations in modern history. As Trump declared from Palm Beach, Florida, the United States would now run Venezuela until the situation stabilized. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as Venezuela's interim president amid a declared national state of emergency. This strike didn't come from nowhere. It was the climax of a pressure campaign that began in September 2025 when U.S. military forces started conducting strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean Sea. According to UN Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari, at least 105 individuals were killed in these strikes between September 2nd and the operation against Maduro. The UN Security Council debated the standoff multiple times, with many nations warning that the US was violating international law. The tension had been building for months. In December 2025, the Trump administration imposed what it called a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil shipments from Venezuela. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy deployed substantial forces to the Caribbean, intercepting tankers and enforcing sanctions with military power. Venezuela responded by having its Navy escort petroleum tankers, setting up direct military confrontation. The U.S. Treasury Department had been tightening the economic noose throughout 2025. Secretary Scott Bessent announced sanctions targeting the shadow fleet of tankers moving Venezuelan oil. 4 companies and their associated tankers, the Nord Star, the Rosalind, the Valiant, and the Della, were sanctioned in late December. The Treasury accused these vessels of helping Venezuela's oil sector circumvent existing sanctions and generate revenue for what Trump called Maduro's narco-terrorist regime. The legal justification centers on the Trump administration's designation of the Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, as a specially designated global terrorist organization in July 2025. Secretary of State Marco Rubio later designated it a foreign terrorist organization in November, enabling what the administration claims are legal military actions under counterterrorism authorities. However, UN experts have stated that no such cartel appears to exist as described, and that the designation was used to justify actions that violate the UN Charter. The immediate trigger appeared to be oil. Trump has been explicit about his intentions. In multiple statements, he said the US would take back Venezuelan oil and that American oil companies would return to the country. The Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University noted that Trump's focus on Venezuelan oil grants credence to critics who argue that U.S. foreign policy under his administration is primarily about resource extraction. Before the strike, the U.S. had seized multiple Venezuelan oil tankers in international waters. In December 2025, U.S. forces seized the tanker skipper off Venezuela's coast. The vessel, carrying Venezuelan crude, was allegedly part of a network transporting sanctioned oil. Earlier seizures included attempts to capture other tankers, with some reports indicating Russian involvement in trying to protect vessels that had reflagged under Russian registration. The military buildup was substantial. Multiple Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the USS Thomas Hudner and USS Gravely, operated in the region. The Coast Guard cutter Stone conducted interdiction operations 67 nautical miles off the Venezuelan coast, well within international waters. When Venezuela attempted to challenge these operations, the response was overwhelming. Reports describe engagements where Venezuelan patrol boats fired on U.S. vessels and were quickly destroyed by Harpoon missiles from U.S. destroyers. The B-21 Raider program, meanwhile, continues its testing phase at Edwards Air Force Base in California. As of January 2026, 3 B-21s are actively supporting the flight test campaign. The first aircraft, designated T-1 and nicknamed Cerberus, made its maiden flight on November 10, 2023. The second flying aircraft, T-2, took its first flight on September 11, 2025. Two additional aircraft, G-1 and G-2, are dedicated to ground testing. The B-21 represents a sixth-generation stealth bomber designed primarily for operations against China in the Indo-Pacific. It can carry both conventional and nuclear weapons, including the AGM-181 LRSO strategic nuclear cruise missile, B-61 Mod 12 and Mod 13 nuclear bombs, and conventional ordnance like the AGM-158 JSSM-ER cruise missile with a range exceeding 620 miles. The aircraft is built with a modular open systems approach, allowing rapid technology upgrades throughout its expected decades of service. Current testing at Edwards focuses on flight performance, stealth capabilities, and advanced avionics systems. According to Air Force Lieutenant General Andrew Gibera, the B-21 program is basically on time, basically on budget, with testing progressing through an event-based process rather than artificial deadlines. The Air Force plans to acquire at least 100 B-21s, though President Trump has suggested ordering 28 more in recent statements, potentially increasing the total fleet substantially. Northrop Grumman is producing the B-21s at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. At least 6 airframes are currently in production. The first operational aircraft will be delivered to Air Force Global Strike Command at Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota, followed by Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, and Dyess Air Force Base, Texas. According to reporting by Sandbox News, the first B-21 Raiders could potentially be ready for combat as early as 2026 if urgent need arises, though the current schedule targets 2027 for operational entry. The B-21's design incorporates decades of advancement over the B-2 Spirit. While both are flying wing configurations, the Raider is smaller, lighter, and integrates far more sophisticated stealth materials and digital design tools. The aircraft's advanced stealth capabilities allow it to penetrate heavily defended airspace that would challenge earlier bombers. Its design philosophy emphasizes affordability and maintainability, addressing criticisms of the extremely expensive B-2 program. Back to Venezuela, the international reaction has been swift and divided. Brazil and Mexico offered to mediate tensions between the US and Venezuela, with Mexico's representative to the UN Security Council emphasizing that dialogue and negotiation are the only legitimate and effective ways of resolving existing differences. However, the Trump administration has shown little interest in diplomatic mediation, with Trump stating he was leaving the possibility of war on the table. The UN has issued strong condemnations. UN experts denounced the partial maritime blockade as violating fundamental rules of international law, noting that there is no right to enforce unilateral sanctions through an armed blockade. The experts stated that such a blockade constitutes illegal armed aggression under the General Assembly's 1974 definition of aggression and potentially gives Venezuela a right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Venezuela's allies have reacted with alarm. Ambassador Samuel Moncada quoted Simon Bolivar at the Security Council saying, "The United States seems to be destined by Providence to plague Latin America with misery in the name of liberty." Russia and China, both longtime supporters of the Maduro government, have condemned the action, though their responses remain primarily rhetorical. The oil market implications are significant. Venezuela currently produces substantially less than its peak capacity due to years of underinvestment and sanctions. A total collapse in Venezuelan production and exports would tighten the supply of heavy crude to both the US Gulf Coast and Asia. However, analysts at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy note that oil markets could manage such losses given oversupplied conditions following the return of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day in OPEC Plus production during 2025. The strategic calculation appears to hinge on OPEC Plus production policy, which has kept markets well supplied and oil prices moderate. This may have given Trump flexibility for more aggressive policy against Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. As analysts noted, it's an open question whether Trump would have taken such dramatic action if oil prices were above $90 per barrel. The future remains uncertain. Trump has declared the US will run Venezuela, but the administration has offered conflicting statements about the duration and nature of any transitional government. Trump declined to endorse Edmundo González Urrutia, the opposition candidate who appeared to win the July 2024 election that Maduro claimed victory in through fraud. This ambiguity raises questions about U.S. succession planning and long-term strategy. Security concerns loom large. It remains unclear whether loyalists of the Maduro regime and remaining members of Cuban intelligence will resist U.S. control. The U.S. has not had a diplomatic presence in Venezuela since its embassy closed in 2019, presenting a significant hurdle to governance beyond phone calls from senior White House officials. For energy companies, the situation presents both opportunity and risk. Few U.S. companies are likely to return to Venezuela until there is a reliable legal and fiscal regime and stable security situation. The prospects for Venezuelan oil production and exports remain uncertain until there is clarity on sanctions, licensing, and who actually manages the central bank and Ministry of Finance. The operation represents what the Trump administration calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as outlined in the 2025 National Security Strategy. The administration views this as re-establishing U.S. strategic predominance in the Western Hemisphere and sending a deterrence message to Beijing and Moscow. Just days before the operation, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was reportedly wargaming combat operations in the Western Hemisphere, and a new official Chinese strategy for Latin America refused to recognize the region as of special significance to U.S. security. As of January 7, 2026, the situation continues to evolve rapidly. Venezuelan security forces are patrolling the streets of Caracas. The U.S. military maintains a substantial presence in the Caribbean, and the world watches to see whether this dramatic military action leads to Venezuelan democratization or prolonged instability in a region already struggling with migration crises, economic collapse, and humanitarian suffering. The capture of Maduro marks an unprecedented moment in U.S.-Latin American relations. Whether history judges it as liberation or aggression may depend entirely on what happens next in Venezuela and whether the Trump administration can deliver on its promises of peace, liberty, and economic recovery for the Venezuelan people.